The Met Gala is a fundraiser for the Met Museum in New York City, and it is held on the first Monday of every May. So essentially, they have this very publicized party where a bunch of celebrities show up and they're donors, and they give money to the Costume Institute. Following the event, the museum will show its new exhibition to the public. This year, the exhibition is called Costume Art. I learned recently that you're not supposed to call them exhibits. Exhibits is something you see at the zoo. Someone who worked at a museum was like, you have to call them exhibitions. So lesson learned. So there are two things that happen at the Met Gala, right? There is the actual exhibition, and then there is the dress code for the gala. I quote, "The show will examine the centrality of the dressed body, juxtaposing garments and works of art from across the museum's vast collection to create pairings that not only illuminate the indivisible connection between clothing and the body, but also the complex interplay between artistic representations of the body and fashion as an embodied art form." What I take from that is that the museum will be showing fine art paired with fashion pieces to sort of show the mutual inspirations and connection between the two. Vogue put out an article, which I think will probably be similar to what the exhibition is like. Ahead of the 2026 Met Gala, Vogue staffers share their favorite pieces of clothing and art. So maybe you'll have this painting of Joan of Arc and then what Zendaya wore to the 2018 Met Gala, which was by Versace and was obviously inspired by and very reminiscent of the classic Joan of Arc look. The Met Gala dress code, on the other hand, is just fashion is art, which invites guests to express their relationship to fashion as an embodied art form and celebrate the countless depictions of the dressed body throughout art history. Obviously, that's a little abstract, but the guideline itself, fashion is art, states their point of view very clearly that they consider fashion to be art, or at least an embodied art form, as they keep calling it. So you're probably like, what is the big deal? Fashion can be art? Sure, why not? Well, it turns out there is a very long history of famous fashion designers vehemently stating that fashion is not art. In 2023, the Met actually put out an article called "Art is Art, Fashion is Fashion," which is a famous quote by Karl Lagerfeld, who most famously designed for Chanel. And they go through the article sort of disputing that fact by actually pulling looks from Chanel and comparing them to famous art pieces. Marc Jacobs is also quoted as saying, "Fashion to me is not art because it is only valid if it is lived in and worn. I make clothes and bags and shoes for people to use, not to put up on a wall and look at. I think clothes in a museum are complete death." I think possibly one of the most compelling things to read on this discussion is this interview with Valerie Steele. Valerie Steele is director and chief curator of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology. She has personally organized more than 25 exhibitions since 1997. She's also founder and editor-in-chief of Fashion Theory, the journal of dress, body, and culture. So she obviously has thought very deeply about this. She says, "We routinely go to museums and art galleries just to look at art, to soak up new ideas or new images of beauty. We don't normally do that with clothes. We look on the street to see what other people are wearing and look in the mirror to see if we look okay for a meeting that day. We're not usually in that kind of disinterested, abstract mode where you're going, I wonder what they were thinking when they made it like that." Some of the best designers ask some of the same questions as art. Balenciaga, for example, how can I measure this volume? Or McQueen, how can I get across the anguish I felt about being gay and being rejected? Those are interesting questions, which are unusual. Designers are usually thinking, what can I get to sell? What will the Park Avenue princess wear this season? Those are not really art questions. The article is called "Valerie Steele, Fashion is Not Art," and that's okay. In parentheses, I will leave the link down below. I do suggest it. The interview also starts with this great question, which is, why do we need things to be art? It seems like a legitimizing force. Do we need video games to be art? Do we need movies to be art? Can they not be entertainment or activities or community building? What is it about art that makes something worthy and lofty? I actually talked to my friend Alanna Okun at her birthday party. She is a writer and a textile artist and now video game designer, so I thought she was in a really good milieu. She wrote this book, The Curse of the Boyfriend Sweater, if you know it, and now she's moving towards video game design. I was asking her, because she's working on her thesis right now, I was like, there is also a large standing argument about whether video games are art. I was like, how do you feel about what you're making right now? And she was like, I do think of it as an art piece. She was like, it's not the most fun video game to play, and that's not the intention she has going into it. But also, I think because she is a knitter and a textile artist, she's like, sometimes, though, not everything has to be art. Sometimes things are just craft. They're just craftsmanship. And craft is also a worthwhile and important thing for us to spend time and money on. Before we move on, I want to thank the sponsor for this video, Monarch Money. I got married about a year ago. My first year anniversary is coming up. And around the same time, I also transitioned from, well, I was already freelance, but I was like permalance. I was working mostly for one company. And I started becoming a content creator full time. So essentially working for myself, made an LLC. So it was a big change to combine my finances with my husband and also get a business bank account and just restart my financial life. I cannot overstate how much Monarch Money is a great tool for what I've been doing. So essentially what it is a private ad-free personal finance platform that brings all your accounts into one space. So instead of what I had been doing previously, which is like sitting down once a month, logging into every single account, going through the transactions, like seeing what we might need to move over to business expenses, I just have one place where I can see everything and it tracks everything. You can make a budget, you can set saving goals, which I need to, now that I've sort of figured out my situation, I would like to start saving for retirement and, who knows what. So it is an amazing, amazing tool. When we first got married, we were using Excel sheets and it was a lot of manual input and adjusting things constantly. And it was a lot more work than I think either of us wanted to do. But now with Monarch Money, we have full clarity and insight into where our money is going and what we are spending it on. It syncs with over 13,000 institutions, so you shouldn't have any trouble connecting your bank. And you can use it on both web and mobile. If you guys are interested, you can start a free trial and get 50% off your first year by clicking on the link in my description. You can scan this QR code. You can use my code PB50. All of those will work. And now we can get on with the rest of the video. Before we dive into all of this, I think the first and most obvious question is, well, how do we define art? How can we talk about what is art and what isn't if we don't define art first? I'm going to be honest, it's a heady question and it's also very philosophical and it's also controversial. So my definition of art is not going to be the same as many other people's. But if you're interested in some of the most common ways that we define art, I'm going to copy another article down below from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy just called The Definition of Art. And they go through a whole bunch of different ways to define art. To my annoying point, they actually have a whole section about skepticism about definitions of art, which is like, is there a possibility that we can even define art in a way that is satisfying? Is there a value in trying to have a definition of art, or is this a really like it is individual to every single person and they'll know it when they see it? The problem with definitions is that you can pretty much argue about any definition. Me and my friends were arguing about what a chair is. We were like, does a chair have to have a back? In that case, is a stool not a chair? And then what is a stool if not just something you sit on that has no back? And then is a rock then a stool? What is a seat? Is a seat anything you sit on? You can just go on and on and on about pretty much anything with your friends if you're really bored. Art can also be very cultural. So you have this Western conception of the 5 major arts, which are painting, sculpture, architecture, poetry, and music. People also argue whether architecture is art and so on and so forth. But then you have anthropologists or travelers go to other countries or visit other cultures and be like, oh, well, they only have quote unquote decorative arts, pottery or textiles or what have you. And then they think, well, this culture is not as evolved as ours. Their art is still tied to utility while ours is separate from it. And then again, you fall into this sort of hierarchical thinking. I like this quote from the Stanford article. A fifth argument against defining art with a normative tinge takes the fact that there is no philosophical consensus about the definition of art as reason to hold that no unitary concept of art exists. Now, I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I didn't lure you in here to be like, there is no such thing as art. No one can define it. There's no reason to have this conversation. That's not what I'm saying. I actually do have a pretty strong feeling about what I think the usage of the term art is. The way I actually came to my own sort of clarity of thinking about it is to look at artists, not at fashion designers. Because there is a whole group of people who are artists. They don't consider themselves to be designers. They don't operate inside the fashion industry. However, they use fashion or clothing or textiles in their art as a medium. And they had a lot of interesting things to say. I just felt like, okay, if some designers don't consider their work to be art, well, let's see what people have to say who do consider their work to be art. The first person I want to talk about, I think, really bridges both worlds. It is Miguel Adrover, who started as a designer and now considers himself an artist. A documentary actually recently came out about him called The Designer is Dead. It tells a story about how Adrover went from one of the most celebrated young designers in New York City to a recluse who lives in his grandmother's house in rural Mallorca. Adrover was born in Mallorca in 1965. He's completely self-taught. He barely had any schooling. He moved to London where he was friends with Alexander McQueen and sort of came up in London's punk fashion scene in the 80s and then moved to New York City in the 90s. A lot of people consider him to be a pioneer. The things that were in his early collections are things that the fashion world has been discussing ever since. reappropriating common fashion iconography, recontextualizing it in a different way, diverse casting, clothes recycling, sustainability. He put all of that down the runway. In 2000, he won the CFDA's Emerging Designer of the Year award. People like Anna Wintour were endorsing his work. And then everything changed after September 11th. Adrover had spent some time in Egypt gathering inspiration and then put together 2 East meets West collections in the run-up to 9/11. The timing was fairly bad. His show Utopia was shown in New York on September 8th, 2001. He was accused of being sympathetic towards the Taliban's misogyny and conservatism, and the financial backing behind his label pulled out. He continued to show collections independently until 2005, took a break for a while, and did his last collection in 2012. What I and probably other younger people know him from is actually his Instagram account. He says, "The Designer is Dead is a post I made around 7 or 8 years ago when I started my Instagram page, when I had found a way of communicating that wasn't fashion presentations or catwalk. When I moved back to Mallorca, I found photography, which saved my life and kept me from going crazy. When I posted it, it was about finding photography. Clothing is still a way of communicating to me." His online posts are mostly self-portraits, where he dresses himself up in very elaborate or sometimes even slightly disturbing outfits to make a political point. He does consider himself an activist. And when I say disturbing, I don't mean that negatively. I mean it in the way that art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. And for him, his collections have always been about politics or racism or modern day atrocities. He said, "When I made my first presentation in 1999, the Zapatista revolution in Chiapas was going on, and that's what I was looking at and inspired by. It wasn't fashion, but I saw that through clothing, fashion was a platform for which I could attack directly. The day after a show, you were in the newspapers and people were talking about you." In an interview I read, which I will also link below, he talks a lot about corporate fashion. And when people say fashion isn't art, they're talking about like capital F fashion, fashion as an industry. And his point is that most of the people who work in the industry are creative servants. He says their biggest hope is to get hired by a corporation like LVMH. We have to think about how, Saint Laurent did a lot to free women with his tuxedo, as did Coco Chanel and all that, but that was 60 or 70 years ago. It made sense at the time. They helped change things and helped highlight women in ways that hadn't been before. But they don't have meaning anymore. Those companies don't need to exist or have power over society. What sustains it is that everyone is willing to sell themselves. Celebrities, actors, musicians. It's pretty sad because corporations are buying it all. In the end, what happens is that it becomes impossible for young people to have platform and to in any way compete because they're taking over the market. And I think that is actually part of his current Instagram success, and he recognizes it. He says, "I see it on my Instagram page. People are desperate for someone to tell the truth that can represent us in a way that's not superficial. There's a lot of people who are interested in clothing and like to dress up who are not connected to this superficial world. Clothing has a lot of power over society. Today more than ever, we need to use it for something that helps us all, not to just build walls between us and to silence the truth." Actually, one of his critiques of the documentary The Designer is Dead is that it didn't cover his activism enough. He wants to be posited as someone who is doing something with his work, who is communicating a political message. Adrover has recently self-published a book, Miguel Adrover Self-Portraits, and he says, "Today I consider myself a photographer. Fashion was just a phase of my creative evolution. The aesthetic is the same and it comes from my guts. What is different is just the form it takes." Now, there are a lot of other artists who use fashion as an art form in a different way. Recently, I've been reading a lot about Camille Carper, who just finished a performance called As Possible, where they aim to wear as many clothes as possible every single day, culminating in wearing 80 pounds of clothing. So their practice takes the form of performance art, though clothing is a very important part of it, functioning as both sculpture and costume. They make all the garments themselves. And Carper actually initially studied fashion design at Parsons, thinking that they would just become a fashion designer, but was more attracted to conceptual art by the time they graduated. Carper says, "I'm also interested in setting up these kinds of contradictions. I'm trying to be excessive, but I'm putting my excessive labor into these garments, and I'm accumulating at a mass scale. I'm proposing that it is for one body and it is to be worn all at once. I always find that these rules I establish for myself tend to mimic some kind of other system that already exists within our economy or within fashion. And I'm always excited about finding those intersections and magnifying one aspect of maybe consumer culture and then pinpointing what it is, that desire, and exploring it in a more controlled manner." Their previous project was As Little as Possible, where they wore as little as possible. Camille's work reminds me a little bit of Andrea Zittel, who since the early 1990s has been doing this A to Z uniform project. These are very personal projects. Zittel essentially lived in a tiny storefront in Brooklyn and didn't have any room for clothes. "If I had a single personal uniform," she says, "it wouldn't take any room to store. I put my energy and resources into making the perfect garment that could be worn day after day." The project has gone through many different forms. Originally, she made everything out of rectangles, and then she would use a single thread. Then I think she was knitting. Zittel also does her own weaving, and she decided to do this project with Malloy and Sons of Donegal and the Tweed Project of Galway. She wanted to make things out of tweed that could be borrowed, like a lending library. She says, "We will keep a couple of the finished garments on mannequins in the gallery. The rest will be for visitors to borrow. Each time it is worn, it becomes a palimpsest, a different use for the same object. I've always wanted my work to travel out in the world, and for people to have the opportunity to engage with it directly in a way that's not confined to the awkwardness of the exhibition space, which I think reflects back to what Marc Jacobs was saying about whether fashion is art, because he's like, well, people don't wear art. Well, in this case, people are wearing the art. Of course, I have to also mention Nick Cave, who I think is one of the most wonderful clothing as sculpture artists. His work is also very performance-based and also personal, emotional, and political. He earned his MFA from Michigan's Cranbrook Academy of Art in the late 1980s and opened a store to sell his clothing design, so he wanted to be a clothing designer. But at the same time, he was making art. He began to produce his famous sound suits after the beating of Rodney King in 1991. He conceived of his wearable artwork as a shield to mask one's gender or race or class. He said, "Making garments and presenting them on my friends as a performance via parade was a favorite way of working." I mean, this man, he was a fiber arts student, he studied dance under Alvin Ailey, he's really got it all. Sorry, I had to stop recording because my room got too hot. New York City is having this weird heat wave in the middle of April, and I don't have my AC set up yet. But anyway, we were talking about Nick Cave, who, similarly to Miguel Adrover, has always been very upfront about the political and social and racial structures that inform his work. In a 2023 interview, he said that he didn't used to consider himself an activist, but now he does view himself in that light. He has produced sculptures of dismembered body parts. He's laid out ammunition casings in the shape of the American flag. And remember, his sound suits came out of his reaction to police brutality. If you don't know that much about Rodney King, I would definitely suggest doing some research. It's important history to know, especially if you're in America. But footage of the LA police beating Rodney King was recorded and then released nationwide on news channels. Afterwards, the officers were acquitted and there were huge riots in response. Nick Cave says, "I thought I was living in a world with a conscience, but that woke me up in a different way." In this state of mind, Cave starts collecting twigs and making a sculpture that functions as armor. Naomi Beckwith, deputy director and chief curator of the Guggenheim, says, "What Nick is incredibly good at is transforming something that is quite agonizing into something that can be beautifully joyous." The sound suits are typically shown in galleries or in performance. I haven't seen one myself, but you can watch them on YouTube. I find these recordings to be both deeply moving and aesthetically wonderful. There's obviously a lot of performance when it comes to the fashion world in general. Runway shows are an excellent example. Certainly Alexander McQueen is known for that, but we also have the classic Carol Christian Pole show, Mainstream Downstream, where models floated down the Naviglio Grande, which is a canal that runs southwest through the city of Milan. Sometimes people complain that these sort of dramatics are relegated to the past, but we have modern day runway shows, I think, that still pick up on these sorts of theatrics, like the most recent Maison Margiela Haute Couture Spring Summer 2024 show. The creative director for the show, John Galliano, which that's a whole nother video, but putting that aside for the moment, he said he was heavily influenced by Pazai, who was a Hungarian sculptor and photographer. The show was beautiful and moody and haunting and full of craft and story, and it took the internet by storm, rightfully. There's a lot of other, watching and reading you can do about it. On the other hand, you have shows like the ones Bottega has been putting out recently, which are almost solely focused on the clothes and the craft, and there's less storytelling and there's less emotion, but some of the clothes and movement and texture are actually evocative of Nick Cave's sound suits. So here, of course, is the issue with absolutist statements. Fashion is art, fashion is not art. We have some shows that feel very much like art, can be interpreted as art, are influenced and created in the same way that artists make their work. And then you have shows that maybe are not so much that way. I think what has helped me personally is stepping away from the idea that we need to designate what is art and what is not, but rather using art as a lens to interrogate something, to investigate something, to interact with something. If you go to a runway show, or more likely watch a runway show online, I think you're well within your rights to think about it just as a marketing tool and investigate it in the lens of commerce. Who are they trying to sell to? How were their numbers last year? Who's the audience? What's going to sell? What's the big push, for Dior this season? What is Chanel making that's going to work? What is Gucci putting down the runway that is going to be their big seller? These are all ways you can think about it. I would not say that that makes the thing you're looking at not art, but rather you're just not thinking about it as art. You're not interacting with it as an art form. Totally fine. You can also go to a runway show and be open to the aesthetic experience of it, the emotional experience of it. You can watch interviews with the designer and hear about their inspirations and their thoughts and their emotions and their personal history that they put into it, or even like the world history or cultural history that they've put into it. And that, I think, would be interacting with the work more as art. Obviously, when you go to a store, that's not really an artistic experience. I think curating your own outfits can be an extremely artistic experience. I see outfits all the time that I'm like, this does feel like art to me. It is created in a way that people would create a work of art. It is maybe even thought through in a way that people would make art. It's expressing someone's life and experience and emotions and place in society. And that is all artistic. I think to this point, you could easily go to Nick Cave and have a conversation with him that is just about craft. Literally, how does he find his materials? How does he put them together? How does he make sure that people can move and see and dance freely in his outfits? Like, really talk about the nuts and bolts of the process. You could also talk to him about what it's like working with museums or finding grants, or like the kind of unromantic nitty-gritty of being an artist and how he makes that work for himself. So I think when we say fashion is art, we are setting up the type of conversation we want to have. And you can see this actually going back to the article that the Met put out about Chanel and its art inspirations. This article, Art is Art, Fashion is Fashion, the Met sets up Karl Lagerfeld's feelings about, why fashion is not art. And then they go through and they talk about his work as if it is art. So obviously, I think it's more about the conversation that they want to have about Chanel. They're not writing this article talking about Karl Lagerfeld's experience or background as a designer or Coco Chanel. They're not giving you, the history of the house and the materials and the silhouettes. It's not cut and dry like that. They're talking about inspirations and impact, where these things come from, how they're made, why it's important, why it's culturally relevant. That is a conversation you have about art. Obviously, a lot of these conversations can be had about anything, a lamp, a car, and some people would say those things are also art, and they very well may be. So in some ways, I really do agree with Valerie Steele. If you remember, she says, some of the best designers ask some of the same questions as art. So she's saying some designers are asking art questions, and some are not. I do think, though, and back to Miguel Adrover's idea of creative servants, I don't think just because you work for a corporation doesn't mean you're not able to make art. It's kind of a long-standing, I think, struggle for creative people who do work for big companies. I used to work for Marvel and by extension Disney, and you have a whole bunch of people who are trying to make good work within the confines of that system. And sometimes you do have something come out of that system like Andor, which I think I would say is an excellent TV show, one of the best pieces of Star Wars media ever made, has a real thing to say, has many, many important things to say about our society and our culture, et cetera, et cetera. Highly recommend giving it a watch. But by the same argument, you have other TV shows and movies coming out of Disney that you feel may not be as fully developed. And then, unfortunately, we're getting maybe into the question of like good art versus bad art, which is of course going to be totally subjective. I still think you can watch something like, we saw the drama the other day. We talked to someone who was like, I had a good time, but I don't think it had anything to say. And me and my friends were talking over and over about what we thought the movie had to say. And I think it touched on a whole bunch of things sort of shallowly, but nothing too in-depth. And I actually think they had two options for that movie. They could have done a more ridiculous black comedy, which black comedies can still be about things, or they could have done a more interesting sort of social, cultural character study. And they kind of did half of both, and I think maybe not enough of either, but this isn't a video about the drama. The point about the drama is that someone went to the drama and said, this is entertainment. I'm not thinking about it this way. They had a good time. They left. They were like, great. The performances were nice. The clothes were beautiful. The apartment was pretty. I went in with my friends and we were like, we are going to think about this in this way. And we had a long drawn out conversation about what the actors thought and what the filmmaker thought and what the visuals meant and what the, different lines of dialogue meant. And that is just taking it seriously as art and investigating it as art. So that I think is ultimately my point. You can sort of get out of it what you're willing to put into it. And the Met is saying we want to look at these things as art. We want to consider them art. We want to think about them as art. We want to position them as art in the art world among other art objects. And that will be the lens in which we are putting this exhibition together. I, for one, am very excited to see it. I love fashion exhibitions. The Brooklyn Museum also does a bunch of really good ones. I think they had a Dior one that I really liked. And there's like Battle of Versailles ones. Anyway, I always suggest a fashion exhibition, especially because most of us, we can't go to runway shows. So that's a lot of times the only time you're ever going to be able to see haute couture in person. Anyway, Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and of course, let me know what you think.